Hey everybody, today we are picking up with where we left off in the PowerPoint from Monday, which is the problem with billiards. As a reminder, the big takeaway from this material is that culture is not bounded, static, fixed, or monolithic. It is fluid, dynamic, historical, and multiple. And so I'm going to provide examples of this using different ethnographic case studies. And I'm going to then have y'all think about how this material applies to the readings about the crack cocaine economy, which is really a lovely article. It's a classic in anthropology because it takes something that we often think of as negative, crack economies, and says, how does this make sense to the people who are doing it? And looks at it. And when you start looking at that, what you start to see is this entire other side of what's happening socially, including the subtle, violent protocols involved in white-collar professional cultural norms and what is expected, and the ways in which that kind of labor is implicitly coded as English dominant and implicitly coded as racialized, as white. And so when you have Puerto Rican migrants who are not necessarily familiar with the norms of quote unquote professional culture, right? Because these are social norms, you have to learn them. It's learned behavior, which means you have to have access to the mechanisms where you learn it. And even if these workers have command of English, they don't necessarily have command to the specialized repertoire of English that is office professional culture norms language. So what we see here is that there are a kind of set of what we could think of as symbolic resources or symbolic capital that if you don't have access to, it's actually harder to find that kind of stable employment in those settings, particularly with the decline in unionized factory wage labor following the 1970s. And to do this, to think about this material, I want to introduce a new concept, which is the concept of the other. The other is a framework for thinking about how we imagine social difference, how we imagine other people. Not how other people actually are, but about the concrete repercussions of our representations, our symbols, our representations of how other people are. So, for example, in the Japanese version, right, it's very clear to American viewers that the representations of Americanness in Japanese popular culture are actually quite distinct from people's everyday lives in the United States, right? The representations and the realities don't really match. We see the same thing in Tahiti. There are these representations of how native Tahitians are in postcards, but that is quite distinct from the actual lived experiences and realities of living Tahitian peoples. So when we talk about the other, we're talking about representations, and that's actually distinct from the other human being over there, because that human being can always surprise us by being more than what we had imagined, more than we'd assumed, more than our stereotypes. And as I talk about these ideas, one way to think about them is that I am taking the idea of culture as a symbolic system and I'm applying power to that definition. How do we think about our symbols as part of systems of power, as themselves power relations? We saw that, like, so for example, just a minute ago I mentioned the idea of symbolic capital, the idea that having access to professional culture norms was a form of capital. It's a symbolic resource. That's an intersection of our symbols and systems of power. And this is another way for thinking about the ways that our symbolic systems are always already inflected by power relations. So when we talk about the other is, again, the idea that we have of the other is we can think of it as a relationship between self versus other. Now, what this means is that part of the way we imagine who we are, who the self is by imagining somebody different and comparing ourselves and saying, oh, well, we're the opposite of them. So in Tahiti Intertwined, we see a really clear example of this. How are native Tahitians represented in tourist media? Well, they're represented very feminine, very sexualized, wearing less clothes, brown-skinned, closer to nature with things like clothing that is more where the environmental I don't know, it's not like cotton where you can't necessarily see the cotton plant. I'm not sure how else to explain it. All of these ideas, right, of like the idea of, and ultimately this representation, this stereotype is the stereotype of a primitive society, right? Less access to technology, closer to nature, even wearing less clothes, right? That's a very Christian set of symbolism. That is in Christian theologies, in cultural contexts, even if you're not Christian, that come out of that history, that symbolic history. Nakedness is innocence, it's childishness, it's a kind of prior to the fall. And so in this way, Tahiti comes to represent this kind of Edenic place that is removed from civilization. You go there on vacation because work is too much. And we expect to burn ourselves out. We expect to actually not like that. And that you have to go escape it by finding this kind of Edenic place of wilderness, of naturalness. So that's a built-in component of capitalism, is that we are expected to try to escape it, and those escapes are contained within further economic systems like the tourist industry, and by the symbolic representations where we even imagine what we can escape to. And what we can also ask what kinds of escapes we cannot imagine within those symbols, those representations given to us. And so, what's being imagined here in this article with Tahiti is the idea of Western civilization itself, right? And whenever I talk about Western civilization, I put it in quotation marks. I actually don't believe Western civilization is a thing. That's my anthropological analysis. Western civilization is not a real thing. It is an ideological construct. And we imagine it by defining the other. Places like Tahiti, or in the case of Mendoza-Denton, we imagine gang girls, right? And in opposition to the other, one assumes, oh, well, if they're gang girls, they're deviants, then I'm an upright citizen. I'm a moral person. If Tahitians are closer to nature, then I'm closer to technology and further away from nature. If Tahitians are brown, I must be white. Because this is a very racially situated thing, the idea is the self is not actually you as a human being. The self is also imaginary. It's that same unmarked category of the human that we're constantly imagining that I've been talking about before, right? The self is not you any more than the other is not that person over there. These are our representations. These are our symbolic systems, and those symbolic systems are inflected with power dynamics that shape what we consider normal and natural. And we see this again really clearly in the article about Tahiti, right? There's all these tourist representations of Tahitians as the other, And yet actual Tahitians exceed those stereotypes, exceed those representations in this moment of mass protest against nuclear testing. And we can always look for those moments where the other turns out to be more than they were thought to be in advance. Those are always really interesting moments for an anthropologist. So going back to this idea of Western civilization, we create these representations of what is Tahiti, and now everyone in the United States, everyone in France knows what Tahiti is because we've seen the postcards, we've seen the movies, we've seen the images. We've never been to Tahiti, we may never even met anyone from Tahiti, but we have an idea of what Tahiti is by virtue of the representations, the symbols, the images that we are immersed within. Going back to a previous week, this is simulacrum. We live in a universe of symbols and representations. That is what is real for humans. And we often conflate those representations with like the world itself, right? We think, oh, of course I know something about Tahiti, but we don't think, oh, where do I get that information? Oh, the tourist industry. Maybe that's not accurate. We just take it for granted. We try to take it for natural. There's a really famous Red Power, which is indigenous movements in the 60s and 70s, right? There's a famous Red Power book that starts off, the plight of the Indian is that everyone already knows who we are. And it's like trying to articulate this idea that everyone already assumes they know what Native American people are like. And they don't necessarily realize, where does that image come from? Where does that idea come from? Does it come from real Native American peoples? No, it comes from like Disney's Pocahontas. But you forget that, and you just conflate those representations with actual other human beings. So this is what the concept of the other helps us get at. And it helps us see these larger power relations in societies, and particularly the way we imagine non-Western societies as a foil, as a category, a cultural category, as a trick that we trick ourselves into believing to perceive reality, which is what culture really is, right? We start seeing this category of the non-Western to imagine that there is something there called the West, called whiteness. And this idea of the West is a historical project that nation states of Europe and the United States and Canada have been building and reinforcing for a couple hundred years now. Not necessarily older than that. It's a pretty recent idea in human history, but it is quite a powerful one in the way that it has shaped real, tangible, global processes and political economic conditions. And that is where we're going from here. So here we have several images that I've given you of Papua New Guinean people. Papua New Guinea is a place in Oceania. It is a the photo in black and white is a bit older. I want to say the late 1800s to the early 1900s, whereas the color photographs are more contemporary. And the example I want to talk about is a social phenomenon in Papua New Guinea called cargo cults. So when you look at these images, what I expect most students to see is something that reinforces that idea, that representation of the other, of the primitive society that is the other to civilization, right? These kinds of racialized colonial systems of representations. There are ways in which these images can feed into that. And what I'm going to do in this PowerPoint is I'm going to give you the cultural context to understand these images in a deeper, more robust way. So let's start with the older image, the black and white image. There is a man, a Papua New Guinean man, wearing a headdress that is made from a Kellogg's whole wheat biscuit box. So what's happening here? To understand this photo, you need to understand the ways indigenous peoples appropriate European things. Same way we saw in Japanese, the Japanese version, although that is not indigenous peoples and the power relationships are different, it is a similar dynamic with different power dynamics. So the thing you have to know about Papua New Guinea is it is one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse places on the planet. There are hundreds of different languages spoken. People are really different from one another, really different societies. And there is, among those hundreds of different languages, there is a pidgin language called Tok Pisin. A pidgin language means it's a relatively simple language. It's used primarily for trade, so it's meant to be easy to learn. It's a good way of communicating with people when you speak a whole bunch of different languages. You have a common language that is simple and easy to learn, which is a pidgin. And Tok Pisin is a combination of various Papua New Guinean indigenous languages and English. It's a hybrid of those things. Now, I'll come back to that, right? But remember, Papua New Guinea, very, very culturally and linguistically diverse place. There is a high value for objects that come from faraway societies. Those are seen as really valuable things to have. Because in Papua New Guinea, the economic system and the value system is based on what we can call a gift economy. A gift economy is really different from a capitalist commodity in several ways, right? In a capitalist economy, you go to the store, you buy groceries or you buy whatever you're going to buy, and you don't have any relationship with the people who made it. You don't have a relationship with the store clerks or anything necessarily. You just go, you exchange the money, and that's it. The relationship is over. You have no further obligations to the store clerks. Gift economies, you do have more obligations. When somebody gives you a gift, they are communicating that they value you. The object becomes a proxy. The value of the object becomes a proxy for the ways that they value you. So, for example, I have a rock in my office. It is a boring-ass rock, and 15, 20 years ago, my sister painted it and wrote her name in Sharpie on it. And it's not even, well painted. It's just, I don't know, just a few lines. And I've held on to this for 20 years because it's a gift my sister gave to me, and I care about her. And so I just carry around this random-ass fucking rock. It's whenever I move, I put it in my boxes, because the rock is not just a rock. It's something that my sister painted and gave to me. So I value it. So that object, again, it's a proxy for the relationship. It's a proxy for my relationship with my sister. And when someone gives you a gift, that is, you enter into a debt relationship with them. You are expected to reciprocate the gift at a later point. If someone gives you a birthday gift, you give them a birthday gift when it's their birthday, right? If somebody brings a cake to you when you move in, you're supposed to bring another dessert to them at a later point. A gift is both a proxy for a relationship, but it's also a way of entering into debt relationships with social obligations. There's an obligation that you will continue to engage in those gift giving. And the point of the debt is never to be resolved in a gift economy. The debt is good because the debt is the promise of an ongoing relationship, and that's what matters. So in Papua New Guinea, where gift economies are really important, having objects from people who are really far away, it's a way of, there's a lot of prestige attached to it, right? It's a way of saying and communicating, hey, these people from far away know who I am, and they think I matter. I matter to these people. I'm important to them. They value me. And so it's a whole prestige system, right? To be able to maintain these relationships. And in fact, in the Pacific, there's this phenomenon called the Kula Ring that anthropologists have been studying for a long time. The Kula Ring is a gift economy of prestigious objects. The objects are things like necklaces or bracelets and things like that. Some objects move around the ring clockwise, others move counterclockwise, but it's like a whole circuit and things just go around and around. And the objects are really important. People know specific bracelets. They know, oh, that's that necklace. I know that one. I know who has had that. I know who has given that. I know what its story is. And the point is to have these objects continue circulating, because when you give that to somebody, it's a way of saying, I value you so much that I'm giving you this really important thing. And then they have it and say, look at how I am valued by this faraway person. And then they in turn give it to somebody else, and the objects kind of move around the Pacific, gift by gift by gift by gift. So that's the Kula ring. And again, it's a really important prestige system. These are not egalitarian societies. It's not exactly a formal hierarchy, but it is differences in prestige that can be translated into power. So now imagine, like, here we are in the early colonial contact moment in Papua New Guinea, and here are these Europeans who are coming and bringing goods from very far away. It fits right into the economic system. It fits right into indigenous value systems and economic systems. And that's very different than, like, for example, I often use Imperial China as an example, as a counterexample, right? Because that was a very different situation. For Imperial China, the idea was, if you're far away from the emperor, you are inherently primitive and savage and not civilized, because civilization emanates from the body of the emperor himself. So if you're European trying to get the Chinese government to trade with you, they look at these objects and they're like, this isn't valuable, right? Because you're so far away from the emperor, this is just not really valuable to us. And there wasn't a desire, because Europeans didn't fit into the economic system in a way that promoted exchange. Whereas in Papua New Guinea, Europeans were able to gain a foothold because of the way these practices made sense within indigenous cultural understandings and economic systems. It was a working misunderstanding of what these things meant. So if you're this Papua New Guinean man and you have this Kellogg's whole wheat biscuit box, it's a way of broadcasting to everyone around you that you are important. You matter, because you have connections to people who come from thousands and thousands of miles away. They travel thousands of miles to trade with you. You fucking matter. That's respect, right? So much like the example of the t-shirt, right? It doesn't actually matter what the box says. The language, the words, that doesn't matter. Just like a t-shirt in Japanese, or I think I gave y'all the example of my Russian t-shirt that said something like bread when somebody translated it. Now, over time, these economic conditions have shifted, right? And became more and more asymmetrical as Europeans developed economic dominance, essentially. So as that happens, we start to see the emergence of new religious and spiritual forms in Papua New Guinea, and particularly a phenomenon called cargo cults. Now in Tok Pisin, cargo means goods or commodities. And so these are basically religious phenomena in which people go and they make things like in these photos, people make landing strips and they make models of airplanes out of wood, and they use hay or things to make satellite dishes or night vision goggles. They create images of technology, right? They create images of cargo that they use in these rituals, right? And it's like the ritual might involve like, hey, like we make a landing strip and we have people doing like the things that people do in airports, right? We have people waving down potential planes and things like that. And the idea is that by doing these rituals, you will then gain access to that material wealth, to cargo, to that value. And so what Papua New Guineans are seeing, and what they are seeing correctly, is that Europeans have at this point obtained, at the point in time of cargo cults, this is shifting now, Europeans have it's slowly shifting, have obtained ritual control over the global economic system. Now, that's a correct interpretation. They are absolutely right. Europeans at that point had seized control of the ritual mechanisms of the global economy. And the idea then is by reproducing those ritualized behaviors, you could then gain access to that control. You could then gain some of that cargo, right? We're reproducing the rituals of an airport, or we're reproducing the rituals of a military base with people marching in rows and lines. Now, the important thing here, I'm going to go and give you more context in the next slide as well, but the important thing here, right, is cargo cults are not expressions of an isolated primitive culture. They are not pre-modern behaviors. This is a modern social phenomenon. This is what modernity itself looks like, right? This is the emergence of capitalism. And this is what capitalism looks like as a global phenomenon, if you look at it from the perspective of Papua New Guineans. This is a function of interconnection. It is a response to interconnections in a global economy. It is not something that is isolated. And I really mean this. We have stereotypes, we have representations of what modernity is that excludes Papua New Guineans. And then we assume, oh, that behavior must be traditional, it must be pre-modern. But no, this is what modernity is in its essence. It's a phenomenon, it's a social phenomenon that would not have existed without European colonialism. Now, there's a book that I want to talk about, which is called Guns, Germs, and Steel by an author named Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond, this book is generally regarded by anthropologists as kind of full of shit. And I'll explain a little bit of why. But it was really popular for a long time in the United States, and many of you may have read it. Essentially, the book is trying to explain, why did Europeans colonize the world? How the fuck did that happen? What the fuck? And his conclusion, right, is basically that Europeans were able to do this because they had access to guns, germs, and steel. And the reasons they had access to those things was because of the environmental conditions of Europe. The environmental conditions were such that diseases, steel technology, and guns were able to be developed. And that was what let Europeans colonize the globe. Now, there's many issues here, right? One is this idea of environmental determinants, and that environmental conditions led to this global history, and like it almost becomes inevitable, like it becomes something natural. Like once human beings have the capacity to colonize, the assumption is they just will. And if somebody else had access to guns, germs, and steel, they would have done the same thing. So it got really popular in the United States, in part because it is a kind of apologist account of colonialism, right? It's like, it's nobody's fault. It's just the environment determined the shape of world history. But what we lose sight of there are the cultural mechanisms. Why was colonization seen as a desirable and good thing to do? Because these are cultural systems where people, what it meant to be a good human being was to colonize people. In Europe, right? This was seen as a morally good thing to do. You could convert souls to Christianity and save their eternal souls from like eternal damnation and hellfire. Or you could accumulate wealth, because there's this cultural idea, we still have it, that if you're wealthy, you must be doing something right. You must be smart. You must have merit. You must be like good at it. You must be good at something. With Spanish colonialism, that's shaped by a whole value system where the assumption is that there's a limited amount of resources on the planet, and that what nations should do is seize control over scarce resources like gold. That is the philosophy that shaped, those are the cultural assumptions that shaped Spanish colonialism of Mexico, Central America, and South America, which is quite different. This is an economic system called mercantilism, by the way, and that's quite different than what we see in later centuries, um, in as colonialism shifts into a capitalist model, in which the idea is you want to extract raw resources from other countries to send them into factories in the metropole and create finished goods that you can then sell back and make profit. So rather than trying to control the reserves of a finite material like gold, it's now we're producing wealth by virtue of extracting resources and making goods, making commodities. This is the exact same reason why Elon Musk every now and then talks about things like, oh, we should send in the military to control Bolivia or wherever it is, because of we want to make sure we can control the lithium mines because we need that for the cars that he's building. It's the exact same colonial model. Now, anyway, guns, germs, and steel, right? So it's losing where there's this kind of implicit assumption that colonization is just human nature. And the reality is a bit more complicated. But one of the moments where we really see the flaws built into the very core, the premises of the book, is actually in the preface. Because in the preface, Jared Diamond talks about walking along the beach in Papua New Guinea with a man called Yali. Now, Yali is a politician. He's a national figure. He's also before he was a politician, he was a cargo cult leader. And they're walking on the beach, and Yali turns to him and says, Jared, why is it that white folks, because in Talk Be Seen, the term for Europeans is white folks, the term for Papua New Guineans is black folks, it is probably worth mentioning that, like, the analogy here is probably less to blackness in America than to indigenous peoples, because this is a colonial relationship rather than blackness in the United States is rather much more closely tied to the histories of plantation slavery and more extractive models of capitalism that took shape in Africa. Anywho, point is, Yali turns to Jared and says, hey, why do white folks have so much cargo and black folks have so little? And Jared Diamond thinks about that for a bit, and in response, he writes this whole book. Why do white people have so much material wealth and everyone else has so much less? How did colonization happen this way? The problem is that Jared Diamond fundamentally misunderstood Yali's question. Remember, in Papua New Guinea, in gift economies, material goods are a proxy for relationships. They're a proxy for that you value another human being and that human being values you. Yali is not saying, why don't we have cool shit? Like, why don't we have more iPhones? Why don't we have more of that stuff? Why don't we have more money? He's asking a fundamentally different question. He's asking, why do black lives not matter? Now, in my second example, I have the other photo, which is a picture of an indigenous person in Brazil shooting a bow and arrow at a photographer who is sitting in a helicopter. Every now and then you see these kinds of images in which they come across the news of a quote-unquote untouched civilization or isolated Native American tribe, something like that, or indigenous tribe, who has, or uncontacted, that kind of language. And this image fits into all of these kinds of colonial stereotypes or representations of the other, right? In this kind of, you have this opposition between a scantily clad indigenous person and a helicopter, right? The technology, right? It fits into that model. And that's how it is spun in news media. However, we can go deeper into this. If somebody is shooting a bow and arrow at you, what are you not going to do? You're not going to land. This is a very effective way of communicating. Hey, don't you dare land here. We don't want you. It's not like anyone thinks the bow is going to take down the helicopter. It's a form of symbolic communication. Indigenous peoples in the Amazon, in every community in the Amazon, and there are many, 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 know what the world is like. They have relationships with other indigenous peoples in the area. They have relationships with the national governments in the area. They know what's up. And if they are doing things like shooting arrows at helicopters, or if they are quote-unquote isolated, it's because they have chosen that path. They have said, we see what's happening here, and we don't want that. We don't want that subordinated position. We want to be doing our own thing here. So please just stay away, and if not, we will shoot you. This is not a function of isolated billiard balls. This is people responding to the circumstances of larger global processes in different ways, right? This person in the Amazon in this photo is engaging with the exact same kinds of issues that we see Papua New Guineans engaging with in cargo cults or in Yali's question. And it's the same questions we saw Norteñas grappling with and Sureños. These are not isolated societies. This is just a matter of different strategies for dealing with a world of global interconnection and global inequalities. So in review, culture is not static, it's not bounded, it's not fixed, and it's not ahistorical. Culture is not a thing. It's something we do. It is dynamic, it is fluid, and it is adapted to historical and political circumstances. And what I've been doing in this week is to take this idea of culture as everything we consider normal and natural, and culture as a system of symbols, and to talk about how those symbols and how those ideas of what is normal and natural are inflected with larger power relations. So here are the discussion questions for today. Feel free to grab one of them. If there's something else that's burning that you want to talk about, go for it. These are just meant to be a guide, not to limit you. With the second question, I will say, don't feel like you have to take on every single part of it, especially with those bullet points. You could write a whole post on language ideologies, right? You don't have to do everything. Lean on your classmates so that you go deeper into what you do go into is really the best thing you can do. Go deeper into what you do go into and see what other students do with the other pieces. And together, we'll kind of cobble the whole thing together.